Hello, good evening, it's John Heaton, and I'm going to do the third in the series of my hypothetical Beatles album, this one covering 1972. Again, thanks for your comments for the last two. I'll be continuing this over the Christmas period, trying to get as many done as possible, going all the way up to 1980, but obviously I'm going to miss out the late 70s when John was not active. 72. And by the way, I can see from your comments, most of you are interested in this topic, but some of you seem to not be. And my advice to you is, if you think this topic is not for you, then just switch off the video. As I've said before, I'm not trying to rewrite history, just a bit of fun. And in my experience, this topic is of interest to most Beatles fans, if not all of them. So I'm going to soldier on and continue with it. Okay, so on the face of it, 1972 was a tricky year because not too many albums were released in the actual year of 1972. In fact, Concert for Bangladesh is the only one, along with Sometime New York City from John and Yoko. So there's 3 singles from Paul McCartney and Wings. There is no album from Paul, no album from George. But in reading this book, which I've referenced before in my videos, an excellent book covering Paul's recording sessions 69 to 2013, it's evident that most of Red Rose Speedway was recorded in 72, so I've drawn from that album, as well as the singles of that year. Live and Let Die was also recorded in 72. And then reading this book, this Keith Badman book, which is another excellent book, he says, starting October 72, George starts a mammoth 3-month Abbey Road recording session for the album Material World. So he laid down all of the tracks in that last 3 months of 72. So I've drawn from that album as well. And I think it's an interesting year and a very interesting contrast, as we've seen in previous videos, between where George is at, which is probably at his most religious of his entire career for this album, Material World, and then where John is at in this particular year, which is pretty political, and Paul is to some extent as well, as we'll see. So I found that very interesting. And one thing I'll say, I could have put on some John tracks from Imagine, which didn't make the 71 album, but I think with John, through most of his career, he's tended to put out stuff pretty quickly after he's recorded it. He wasn't really one for holding stuff in the can for too long. I know that's happened with Paul over the years, and to a lesser extent with George as well. So, but with John, he mostly put stuff out. So I've resisted the temptation of putting some other tracks from Imagine. I've just taken stuff from 72 from him. So side 1, I've opened it with a George track. My previous 2 albums opened with a John track, so I've opened it with the very strong album track from Material World, Don't Let Me Wait Too Long. It's just a gorgeous album track, brilliant guitar work, great band, rhythm section of Klaus Voormann and Jim Keltner. It's a spiritual song, but it's not in your face as such, and great tune. And I think it makes a great opener. I've then followed it with Sea Moon from Paul, the B-side of the High 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 single, and for me it's the better track of the two, and hence and I think I like the sentiment of the song. L7 meaning square, Sea Moon meaning cool, I guess, and Paddy, I like the lyrics. I think it's a great underrated Wings song, and Paul did do this in concert for a while. Not only at the time, but he came back to it in the early 90s. So then I've got John's first track, Woman is the Nigger of the World, which again is quite a controversial track, and I know some of you have said, well, you don't think certain tracks like Imagine would make the cut because they're too controversial for a Beatles album, but I think if the Beatles had been together, they would have definitely gone in this direction because, you know, they were, for the most part, throughout their career, they were true to themselves, and I don't see them diluting their opinions for the sake of the Beatle name. I think, you know, John already was wanting to record Cold Turkey with the Beatles in the fall of '69, so I think this is a perfectly reasonable track to expect to be on a Beatles album of '72, if there had been such a thing. And then I've included Give Ireland Back to the Irish next from Paul, and I know this track is not loved by everyone, but it's just turned up on the Wings Wildlife Archive release as one of the bonus tracks, and it's been fantastically remastered and given a breath fresh of air, really, and it's got a great sound. Henry McCulloch is on great form, Denny Sywell on drums, Paul and Denny and Linda. I think they do a great version, and it's very interesting that John and Paul were both writing songs about Ireland, because the Sunday Bloody Sunday, when 13 people were shot down by the British police, happened in January '72, and both John and Paul both put pen to paper pretty much immediately and came up with a song on the subject. So whereas 6 months before you couldn't imagine them being further apart musically, slagging each other off in the press, here they were in '72, pretty much aligned in terms of what they were singing about, and I gather they did meet just before Christmas or just before New Year in New York in '71 and agreed to stop bitching at each other. So that's quite an interesting dynamic. Followed that Give Ireland Back to the Irish with Back Off Boogaloo, the great Ringo single from '72, where George is playing the guitar and producing. So that's a natural choice. Nice one, Ringo. Words inspired by Mark Bolan, I think. Then I've put in one of Paul's forgotten B-sides, or not forgotten. It's turned up again on the Red Rose Speedway archive release as one of the bonus tracks, and Country Dreamer, the B-side of Helen Wheels, released in '73 but recorded in '72, hence its inclusion on here. Gorgeous track. And then I've finished side one, somewhat controversially, and not all of you are going to like this, with Sunday Bloody Sunday from John from Sunshine, New York City. I just think it's a really powerful song, even if you don't agree with the lyrical message. I think the verses in particular are very powerful, and the chorus is dominated by Yoko on the John and Yoko recording, but if the Beatles were to make a stab at it, maybe they would have all sung along on the chorus, a la Bungalow Bill style, I'm not sure. It's quite interesting to imagine. But it's a very angry song, and it's very heartfelt, and as I say, you don't have to necessarily agree with the sentiment to appreciate where John was coming from, that all the Beatles came from Liverpool, which sometimes was referred to as the capital of Ireland, so they all have Irish roots going back in the family. So it's quite natural for them to react to that event in Northern Ireland in January '72. So that closes side one, and then side two I've opened with Big Barn Bed, the opener for Red Rose Speedway. It wasn't to see release until end of April, beginning of May '73, but it was recorded in 1972. So, and it's just a brilliant opener. I love it to bits. I think John would have really grooved and enjoyed playing on this track, and I think he even commented that he quite liked this album and he liked that track. It's got quite a John feel to it, actually. And it's one of the very best songs on Red Rose Speedway. And then I followed that with John Sinclair from John, which is another political number, a little bit dated these days. It's a very specific subject about a guy who got sent to prison for 10 years for selling 2 loose joints on the street, I think it was. They gave him 10 for 2. What else could the judges do? Gotta set him free. Great song, great slide guitar. One of the highlights of Sometime New York City. Love it. Then I've got George following with Living in the Material World, the title track. A nice stomping number with some great piano. I think it's from Gary Wright or Nicky Hopkins. And then My Love from Red Rose Speedway. Again, released in '73, but performed live by Wings in '72 and recorded. The studio version is recorded in '72. So a bona fide track qualifying for release on this 72 album. Then I've got George, Try Some Buy Some, which he'd originally started in 71 actually, with Ronnie Spector on vocals, and it had been aborted that session. Or had it been aborted? I can't remember if it was released or not, but I think it may have been released. But George went back and decided he'd like to try singing it. It was a little bit high for him in the register, but he does a nice job, and it's lovely strings arranged by Phil Spector. And the song is about the temptation to take drugs and how George was dealing with that. Quite an interesting lyric. And then I've got New York City from John, The Storming Rocker, ending side one of Sometime New York City album. Just great lyrics, sort of a la Ballad of John and Yoko, his recounting his time in New York, really. Waiting for the Jerry to land. His name was David Peel. All kinds of people referenced from the underground movement and from the active political left wing. But also a lot of fun, this track, and the Elephant's Memory are on superb form on the album, and it would have been interesting to see what kind of fist the Beatles would have made of this track. It is a very powerful rocker, and I would like to have heard a Beatles version of it. And then we close the album with That Is All, the closer from Material Worlds, released in 73 but recorded in 72. So beautiful closer from George, beautiful song, beautiful sentiment. Times I find it hard to say, the useless words getting in my way. Silence often says much more than trying to say what's been said before. So great closer from George. Bonus tracks. I've got, rather mischievously, I've suggested a bonus track from Yoko, Yang Yang, which is one of her outstanding tracks from Approximately Infinite Universe. If you don't like Yoko, I would advise you just to check out that one track, because it is outstanding, and I think the Beatles could have recorded it well. I mean, it wouldn't have made the album, but they might have recorded it in one of the breaks or something. And then, because Yoko had a track, Linda might have got them to try Seaside Woman, which is a charming reggae number, and again come to life again because it's included in the Red Rose Speedway archive release as a bonus track. I think it's a creditable effort. So I've got those two as bonus tracks, and I've got Loop, First Indian on the Moon, from Paul from Red Rose Speedway, recorded in 72, released in 73, and I think John would have had fun with that track. They could have mucked around. Great bass from Paul on that track. I love it, and it's kind of a bit wacky. I think they might have tried to lay down a version of that. So this is an unusual album, 1972. We've got 4 John, 5 Paul, 4 George, and 1 Ringo. There we go. You can have a look at that. So I'll be back next time doing 1973. Thank you for watching. See you next time.